Welcome to the presentation on Opal. Sean Gallagher from Millersville University of Pennsylvania and I, Barney Bynes from Ithaca College, will be giving you an update of what the APA Online Psychological Laboratory can do for you during the time of COVID and beyond. So what I'm going to do is I'm going to start to give an overview of what Opal is all about. Some of you may know this already, and in the event that you do, you can just relax and sit back, and then Sean will provide some examples of applications after I finish the general overview. So if you are familiar with Opal, you will recognize what's on the screen now. That's the old introduction, and the new and improved version, at least we hope that it's improved, looks like this. So if you go to opl.apa.org, you'll be able to get to Opal and make full use of it. So it's still free and open to the public. It's one of the things that APA has done to help the educational process. It's about 20 years old now, and it's in need of renovation, and you're going to be seeing what the renovations do look like. One of the changes is that it was designed to be accessible on different kinds of devices that actually didn't exist when it first came out. So you can use it on desktops, laptops, tablets, and cell phones, although there are a few instances where a tablet or a cell phone won't be accommodated, and you'll need to use either desktop or laptop. So who is using Opal? Well, as you can see from this illustration here, since the beginning of the academic year, there have been 2,500 classes involved, and you can see the distribution across the states, with the dark blue representing the highest usage, light blue, lesser usage. But you can see it's very widespread and it's getting a lot of application. And as we hoped, people have been able to access it on mobile devices as well as on desktops, less so on tablets. But what this means is that it really is useful on different devices that students do have now. If you don't have an account already, it's easy to create one. You do not have to be a member of APA. As I mentioned before, it's free and open to the public. And you go to opal.apa.org, and that's the URL that you will make use of. When you get into Opal, you can register your class. You can add as many classes as you have. And one of the things that's convenient about this is if you look at complete data, it gives you a choice of different schools, different classes whose data you can combine with to make sure you have sample sizes that are useful if you want to do data analysis. So you just go to the dashboard, click on My Classes if you have already added classes. If not, down at the bottom, you can see how to add a new class. And the process is fairly simple and straightforward. And everything, as I said, is accessible via the dashboard. And if you want to look at the experiments, or if you want students to engage in them for data collection, you just click on experiments and you see the range of options. And Sean will talk about all the different opportunities in his segment of the presentation. In addition to data collection, one of the nice features is that there are demonstrations in a number of different areas. These aren't data collection, but some of them are quite interactive, and students can learn about content material in various subdisciplines within psychology. And you can take a look, there are biological bases of behavior, there's history, there is quite a lot on sensation and perception, so that students can go in here and actually get quite a lot of good information about content. And a lot of it is interactive and it's quite well done. As for students, the sign up part is quite easy for them, just like it is for educators. All they have to do is go to opal.apa.org. They log in with an account. And again, they don't need to be student members or anything like that. And what they can do afterward is access anything that they're interested in, collecting data, doing demonstrations, and it's a pretty good experience in general. There are a few modules that we're still in the process of renovating, but it's clear when you go on the site which ones those are. But some of the errors that we had before, they have been taken care of, and the site works as we want it to. So that's a conclusion to what I want to say. So now Sean can give you more information about how you can do applications in your classes.
Great. Thanks, Barney. And to all of you there, I can assure you, Barney and I regret not being there in person because I've got about an inch of snow outside and I'm sure he's got a little bit more. So I look forward to real conferences again. But in the meantime, I'll show you what I use Opal for. Although Opal has all of these different kinds of experiments that cover different domains of psychology, I find it most valuable in the methods and statistics classes. And so even before the pandemic time, I've found that Opal provides a great way to quickly demonstrate techniques and generate instant data that the students can start manipulating right away. So in the fall of 2020, as with almost all of us, I suddenly had to budget the face-to-face time I had with my students. I mean, who doesn't love Zooming? But at every opportunity, I gave the students the ability to do classwork on their own so we could maximize the benefit of the face-to-face time. Before the pandemic, we would do our OPL lessons in the classroom where you would have a somewhat controlled environment. Everybody would be running the same experiment at the same time. So there was kind of an implied peer pressure to focus on the task and get things done. So students now were assigned the Opal experiments to do on their own time with no supervision or no peer influence. So it was of great interest to me to see if the results that the students got when they were scattered to the four winds were the same results that I would see when they were in the classroom. So after we made it through this semester, I gave them an opportunity to reflect back on how they used Opal. And similar to the pie chart that Barney just showed, I found that most students still use desktops or laptops. I don't know about what you are seeing, but it seems to me like the laptop computer is the tool of higher education now. That seems to be the iPad hasn't seemed to catch on as the key device for college students. So most of my students are still using desktops and laptops to run these experiments. They said the laptops were the most convenient and comfortable, or the most convenient and comfortable pandemic option. And they certainly appreciated the flexibility, and all of them stated that they had access to platform options. So the students did say, well, yeah, I did have access to an iPad if I wanted to try it, but I was more comfortable doing it with a laptop. So even though they had the flexibility, and I would say that if the student was in a situation where they only had an iPad to work with, they could probably still appreciate what the experiment was trying to show them, even though the experiment may not have run as smoothly as it would on a desktop or a laptop. So here's a breakdown of all the categories. And of course, you can see that Opal can apply to a class in cognitive psychology, social psychology, or sensation and perception. But again, I use it mostly in my methods classes. So I think it's useful, even when teaching a methods class, to reflect back on these different domains of psychology And they're broken down quite nicely here in Opal. You have cognition, individual differences, learning, sensation and perception, and social psychology. And you can have an interesting classroom discussion about what kinds of experiments are most likely to yield the clearest and most reliable data, whether or not you're in the classroom or whether or not you're having the students do the experiments remotely. They should probably be able to appreciate the fact that a reaction time experiment is probably going to give more consistent results, not just within individuals, but across individuals, than perhaps a mirror tracing task or an object location memory task. So you can discuss things like reliability and demonstrate reliability in different experiments by using Opal data. And I sort of did just that. And I took the data that my students generated during the pandemic semester of fall 2020. I typically teach the methods class in fall. And I compared it to previous fall sessions. And I did find that the kinds of experiments that you would expect to be most reliable were still very reliable when the students were running the experiments outside of the classroom. And that is, if you look at the categories that I just showed you, the sensation and perception, especially the visual ones. The auditory ones introduce a little bit of variability that is still a little difficult to govern when the students are not in front of you. But the visually based sensation and perception experiments were highly reliable, followed by the learning category, followed by the cognition experiments, followed by individual differences and social psychologies. So there's an interesting category change from group to group that is probably worth hours and hours of classroom discussion. Barney may have mentioned that there are still a few experiments that are under development, but really all of them lent themselves to data analysis and methodological inspection even during the pandemic. So examples from OPL, let me just take two examples, one being a classic sensation and perception demonstration, and that is the demonstration of Donder's reaction time task. The simple reaction time tasks involve some kind of stimulus being presented, and then a participant is asked to do something very simple like a key press. And Opal demonstrates what Donders learned 150 years ago, and that is as instantaneous as the response feels to the student, there's still about a 200 millisecond lag. No matter how fast you think you are, it takes time to respond to a stimulus. And then you throw the wrinkle of two different kinds of stimuli. And now the participants have to make a decision. I could flash a red light or I could flash a blue light. You could press one key when you see the red light, one key when you see the blue light. And now the decision has added a little bit of time to your response. So this experiment should be one that is fairly robustly reliable, regardless of the situation that the student is being tested in. The mirror drawing task is a step more complicated. The mirror drawing task asks students to use a mouse to trace the pattern of a star. But it's easy enough to do the first time, but once the students have gone through the practice of tracing the star, the mouse rules get reversed. Up is down, left is right. And the students have to pay a little bit more attention, and they have to learn how to adapt to the new mouse format. So when they try to trace the stars with the mouse rules flipped, you find that you wind up getting squiggly lines like that, even if you're lucky. Sometimes they're much worse than that. So here are two examples of two kinds of experiments. One is very basic sensation and perception type experiment, and one is now a learning experiment. So there's a level of complexity that introduces a little bit more sources of error in the data generation and collection. Barney and I will make this slideshow available for you, but on this slide I have a little walkthrough that shows you how to download data and import it into Excel. and kind of prune out the unnecessary elements that can be useful. But there are things like student ID and the date the experiment was run that may not be particularly useful to you. But there was one, my point in putting this video in here is that OPAL stores the amount of time students spend in the experiment. And that is one piece of data that I found very useful when migrating from the classroom environment to the do the experiment on your own environment. And that is, OPAL keeps track of how much time the student needed to take to complete the task. So if they're in a classroom, again, in the supposedly ideal situation of being in the classroom, and it takes them 2 minutes to complete the experiment, well, if they go home and they run the experiment on their own while they're perhaps texting their friends or watching TV, you might imagine that their time in the experiment would get longer. So I locked onto that and I said, well, time in the experiment, if the students are still paying attention when they're running the experiments on their own, I hopefully won't see that total time in the experiment go up when we move from the classroom to the remote learning situation. And sure enough, that's kind of what I found. So here are the results from the reaction time experiments, looking at my in-class students from 2019 and 2018. They are represented in the green bars, and then my 2020 remote students represented by the orange bars. So the total time in the experiment did not differ significantly. As a matter of fact, as you see, again, we shouldn't make too much of non-significant differences, but obviously you see that the orange bar is a little bit lower for total time than the green bar for my remote students. So they're motoring through the task all right. They seem to be on task and completing it in about the same amount of time that it took them in the classroom. There was a statistically significant difference in the choice condition. But as you can see, the results are still comparable. In this experiment, we would expect the simple reaction time task to generate the fastest reaction times, or the shortest reaction times. And the go, no-go, and the choice reaction time tasks are both versions of a choice reaction time task that took a little bit longer. So the moral of the story here is that the time it took them not only to react to the stimuli, but the time it took them to complete the task is comparable, whether face-to-face or remote. And we saw similar results in the mirror drawing task. If you look at these results, it's almost a dead match. So based on these two types of experiments, and again, I would emphasize that these are the experiments you would expect to be most reliable and most resilient, let's say, to the error to the sources of error that will be introduced when students have to perform the tasks remotely. They perform pretty much the same way, whether or not in the face-to-face classroom environment or in the remote environment. So in conclusion, for these two examples of OPL experiments, students seem similarly attentive and the findings are replicable across testing conditions. And of course, when I'm using OPAL in class, as I have been for all these years, I really didn't appreciate how beneficial it would be when we migrated to pandemic land. So OPAL proved invaluable to me as a take-it-with-you learning resource for my methods classes. And of course, reliability is probably a little bit compromised when students are taking or running the experiments using slightly different devices and slightly different locations and slightly different environments. But the loss of control does not seem to compromise the data collected, or I should be more specific and say the usefulness of the data collected or the educational value of the exercises. So even in the remote scenarios that the pandemic has imposed upon us, the OPL demonstrations are still very valuable, and the data are useful. So thanks.
Well, Sean and I have had a good time working together to present this to you, this information to you. I hope that you find it as interesting and enjoyable as we did. The tutorial is being recorded, so you'll have access to it. And at any point, if you want to get in touch with either of us through the wonders of the internet, you'll have no trouble tracking us down. So enjoy the rest of CTOP, and someday in the future, I hope we'll be together in person.
Thanks.